This week on The Impact.
The state legislatures have a decision about the course of decades of transportation funding in front of them.
The federal infrastructure package put money on the table for the state's transportation planners. How should they use it?
We need to prioritize active transportation and public transit. The state's transportation budget, less than 4% of those dollars go towards public transit or active transportation.
I think the real priority for the legislature next session should be road improvements, maintenance and preservation, and congestion relief. Those really need to take top priority.
Should lawmakers focus on a car-free future or accelerate efforts to make things better for drivers? Hear different sides of the debate over the direction of transportation planning.
To meet this state's established climate goals, we need to reduce vehicle miles traveled by 50%. And then we need to electrify the remaining 97% of trips. We're going to do that by investing in alternatives to driving that are usable, that are fast, frequent, reliable, and affordable to people.
I think attacking the single most lucrative activity for the transportation budget, driving, is not equitable or sustainable at all. Stop supporting policies that reduce driving and make it expensive and difficult to get around in a car.
That's all coming up on The Impact.
From Olympia, an in-depth look at decisions at the state capitol and how they impact you. This is The Impact.
Hello and welcome to The Impact. I'm Mike McClanahan. Transportation funding was an important topic for lawmakers when the legislative session kicked off back in January. The House and Senate did approve a supplemental transportation budget, but discussed a much bigger transportation funding package that never materialized. When the State House and Senate reconvene for 2022 in a couple of months, there will be new opportunities in the transportation arena stemming from the new Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. According to U.S. Senator Patty Murray's office, the passage of the $1.2 trillion federal infrastructure package means Washington can be expected to receive $4.7 billion federal aid highway program dollars, $605 million bridge replacement and repair dollars, and $1.79 billion for public transportation. When the state legislature adjourned back in April, there was a lot of discussion about a possible special session to debate a new transportation funding package. The push was led by Senate Transportation Committee Chair Steve Hobbs. The Democratic senator from Lake Stevens supported attaching amendments to two of the carbon reduction policies endorsed by Governor Inslee. Those amendments linked the implementation of the low carbon fuel standard bill and the cap and trade bill to the approval of a 5-cent per gallon gas tax increase to fund a new transportation package. Governor Inslee later vetoed the gas tax requirement in both of the bills. Senator Hobbs was recently named by the governor as the replacement for outgoing Secretary of State Kim Wyman. That means the Senate Transportation Committee will have a different leader in January. On the final day of the 2021 session, members of the Democratic majority in the House and Senate discussed their priorities for transportation funding in the future.
We have put in the foundation already in terms of a transportation package that is going to have at the center a commitment to carbon reduction. I mean, some of what you saw in both the House and the Senate transportation packages are about raising the I-5 so that it's not in floodways. It is about moving, changing highways in exits and on-ramps so that a Ho tribe can move from one side of the highway to the other to higher ground. It is about making sure that we're building Vision Zero and actually building safety into our future investment.
Joining me now to discuss the direction of transportation planning in Washington is Alex Hudson, Executive Director of Seattle-based Transportation Choices Coalition. Thank you for your time today, Alex. Let's start off by just setting the stage here. What do you see as the most important transportation funding decisions facing state lawmakers next year?
Thank you for having me, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. The state legislatures have a decision about the course of decades of transportation funding in front of them, and the decision really relies on whether or not they're going to propose a new transportation package, a full suite of investments and expenditures around transportation. And if so, are we going to stay down the same road we've been going on, or are we going to take a moment here to transform how it is that we do transportation here in Washington?
And could you delve into that a little more? Give us some examples of the types of potential policy direction shifts that you're talking about if they go a new direction.
So I was honored to sit on the Joint Transportation Committee Needs Advisory Committee that was put together last year. And what we learned from that is the state is far short of fully investing in its transportation needs. And in fact, the state has less than half of what it needs in order to deliver active transportation, public transportation, and ports, roads, bridges, maintain our infrastructure. And so we are trying to really create a holistic transportation system that gets people where they need to go, absent half the resources that we need to do so. So the state is going to have to take a look at not only how and if are we going to increase the revenue available, but what are we going to change around expenditures? It is well known that Washington State ranks C- in terms of the state of our infrastructure. I, for one, think that we can do a lot better than being a C- state. And one of the ways that we need to do that is we need to flip the way that we're investing in our existing infrastructure and prioritize the extreme backlog that we have in terms of maintenance and preservation. And we need to start fixing what we have before we indulge ourselves in the conversation around building or expanding on our new infrastructure. The other thing that we really need to do is we need to prioritize active transportation and public transit. The state's transportation budget, less than 4% of those dollars go towards public transit or active transportation. And there are 32 public transit agencies in Washington state. Collectively, they deliver 195 million trips a year. This is more than our ports and our ferries and our airports put together, and they are getting less than 4% of our transportation funding. So we need to really look at what are the ways that we're going to more fully invest in the public transit and active transportation that people are counting on now, and how does that track into our state's bigger goals around addressing climate change, getting to Vision Zero, and creating healthy and sustainable economies and communities.
So on the last note there, one policy proposal or policy directional shift that you see with some of the planning documents, with some of the climate-focused legislators is reducing transportation emissions by means of reducing vehicle miles traveled. In other words, reducing the number of cars on the road, how many vehicle miles traveled, how much that's happening here in Washington. How do you do that in a way where people who, when most people in the state rely on a personal vehicle to get to work or to take their kids to school, how can you reduce vehicle miles traveled without impacting the everyday Washingtonian in the near term?
That's a really good question, Mike. Thank you for asking that. The state in 2008 established some climate goals and did an analysis in order to understand how they were going to get to that. And what they found was that to meet this state's established climate goals, we need to reduce vehicle miles traveled by 50%. And then we need to electrify the remaining 97% of trips. And the important question that you ask is how? How are we going to do that? We're going to do that by investing in alternatives to driving that are usable, that are fast, frequent, reliable, and affordable to people. No one makes decisions around their transportation choices that either cost them more money or cost them more time. So we need to deeply invest both in terms of new infrastructure that supports public transit, things like the light rail build out in the Puget Sound region, but importantly across the state, bus rapid transit lines that are going in Spokane and Vancouver and other places. We need to fund basic bus operations. I talk to a lot of people who tell me that they would like to go from being a 2-car household to a 1-car household, or shift some of their big trips over to public transit. And the reason they don't do that is because right now those public transit agencies don't have the resources that they do to make those trips make sense for people. Unfortunately, many buses come once an hour, once every 45 minutes, and that just doesn't work for families. You're really right to point that out. So we need to start by plussing up the ability to operate the systems and lines that we have now in terms of public transit. And then we need to start investing in a deeper level of infrastructure that makes that public transit usable. In addition to that, we need to make it affordable and accessible, as I mentioned. But long term, we need to start thinking about how we can incentivize and build communities where a car isn't a necessity. It is because of our land use patterns and our housing patterns that people have to do the majority of their trips in their car. I think we learned the value of community, and especially walkable communities in our state thrived more during the pandemic, and people overwhelmingly want to live in places where they can choose whether or not they want to walk to the grocery store. So short term, we need to be investing in the public transit systems that we already have. We need to be future thinking and building out the plans and dreams of those agencies and the communities they serve, as well as the active transportation. You may have noticed about the bike boom. This has been a big topic of conversation, this extreme uptick in electric bike usage during the pandemic. We need to make those be safe choices for people. That means protected infrastructure so that folks can choose bicycling as a safe alternative. And long term, what we need to do is we need to be building the kind of communities that don't force people to drive a car. AAA estimates that to own, maintain, and operate a vehicle in Washington state costs the average Washingtonian $10,000 a year. This is a hidden cost that is being put on the backs of Washingtonians because our state isn't funding the alternatives that people want. So being forced to have a car is a result of policy decisions, and we have the opportunity in front of us right now to alleviate both people's mobility concerns, but also their overall cost of transportation, which, as I said, crosses into the tens of thousands of dollars for Washingtonians.
I want to shift tracks here to talk about the federal infrastructure package. In terms of what it means for your transportation priorities, how significant will this be for Washington state?
It's very significant. This is over $8 billion over the next several years of investment in all the things that I was talking about. Maintaining our infrastructure that we have now, expanding public transit, accelerating towards electrification, expanding broadband. One of the ways that we can reduce vehicle miles traveled is trips not taken, and working from home is one of those ways. However, what I think that it does is it only accelerates the need for our legislature to take action and fully fund and pass a transportation package. Many of these dollars come in the forms of investments into our metropolitan planning organizations like Puget Sound Regional Council here in the Puget Sound, that go into plussing up either existing programs through competitive grants or the existing formulas that states have in mind. And they also, and in so much as they create opportunities for new programs, they require local match from municipalities. So we're going to find ourselves in the situation where we're leaving money on the table because the local municipalities don't have the match that they need in order to take advantage of these new resources that are provided by the federal government. So it means that the MPOs, who are already the distributors of federal money, have more to work with, can fund more projects, fund more need that already exists, and creates the opportunity to leverage these federal dollars. But in order to do so, the municipalities, the cities, the counties, the tribal nations are going to need the state to provide those funds that they need in order to be able to accept the federal dollars.
We've got just over a minute left here. So in summation, With the current state of transportation needs, the West Seattle Bridge out of commission, a huge issue for people that live in that part of the city there. You've got the passes this year will not get the same level of attention likely as they have in previous winters because the State Department of Transportation is shorthanded and the ferry system has been shorthanded, and that's been causing a lot of problems for people that rely on those. What are the immediate investment opportunities that you see? Are there any short-term investment opportunities that you see with the legislative session coming up?
Yeah, the first thing that we can do is fully fund. I mentioned competitive grants that go into the multimodal account. Those are overprescribed every year. There is a bigger ask than we have resources to provide, both in terms of these capital projects and investments that I mentioned. There's the Transportation Improvement Board, a state commission that distributes funding to streets and sidewalks and projects like that. There is a long list of projects that are shovel ready to go that the state already has their eyes on, either through the MPOs, through their competitive grant programs, or through places like CRAB, which is the county roads, or TIB. So they can look into their own archives to see the existing need and how to begin to fund those projects.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much. Again, Alex Hudson, Executive Director of Transportation Choices Coalition. Thank you for your perspective.
Thank you.
For a different perspective on where lawmakers should focus the state's transportation dollars, let's bring on Mariya Frost, Director of the Coles Center for Transportation at the Washington Policy Center. Thank you for your time today, Mariya. Let's start off by setting the stage with this. What do you see as the most important transportation funding decisions facing the legislature next year?
I think the real priority for the legislature next session should be road improvements, maintenance and preservation, and congestion relief. Those really need to take top priority. And what that means is honoring existing commitments and finishing the projects that the public funded in Connecting Washington in 2015 without any further delays from the Department of Transportation, keeping our roads and bridges safe and operational, and prioritizing congestion relief in places like Bellevue on the east side, where current I-405 capacity definitely will not support incoming residential and employment increases.
So some advocates of a more holistic or different approach to state transportation planning say that this is an opportunity for the state to create a vision of different types of transportation options for every person in the state, to create more opportunities for active transportation, more public transit options, ultimately decisions that could lead the state down a path where people could choose whether or not to own a vehicle. What do you think about that idea and the timing given the federal money that's also flowing into Washington? What do you think about that vision for Washington State?
I mean, I think those are important considerations. A lot of them are already locally funded. In 2019, public transit agencies in our state collected about $3.8 billion in sales and local taxes, which is a 192% increase over the last decade. And that doesn't include, as you mentioned, those multiple cash infusions that they've received from the federal government. Now, compare that to state transportation funding, where for the 21-23 biennium, the state is going to generate about $3.3 billion per year from drivers who pay for roads and subsidize other modes. You know, I think that in and of itself is clear evidence that transit is not chronically underfunded, and really should stop asking the state for more money. And instead, I think lawmakers need to kind of move past that and focus on road and bridge maintenance and preservation. All of these things are basic provisions that ensure safe and reliable mobility for drivers, freight, emergency responders, and public transit.
By some estimates, the state would need to spend about twice as much on preservation to clear the backlog of road and bridge maintenance needs and stay ahead of problems that become more expensive later on. When you've got the West Seattle Bridge out of commission, the I-5 Columbia River Bridge that needs to be replaced at some point, and any number of critical transportation hubs in need of attention, how should the state prioritize these decisions?
Obviously, I think they should take top priority. And even though the Department of Transportation says those items are top priority, they're dedicating an awful lot of time and resources to equity advisory groups and ideological efforts that go above and beyond providing safe and reliable mobility for the traveling public. I would also point out that if lawmakers and policymakers at the Department of Transportation and the governor's office are serious about improving our roads and bridges, as you've mentioned, then they will stop supporting policies that reduce driving and make it expensive and difficult to get around in a car. I think attacking the single most lucrative activity for the transportation budget, driving, is not equitable or sustainable at all. So I think they really need to address that in some way. When we have this conversation about transportation funding, you either eliminate these conflicting policies that attack driving while depending on driving for revenue, or you really need a new approach to funding roads.
Given the federal infrastructure package and all of the money that will be coming to Washington State, is this an opportunity for state lawmakers to make a big difference in some of these projects?
I think so. I think, what I'm most concerned about the federal money coming in, specifically, the $1.79 billion, which includes $381 million for Sound Transit, whose ridership is 75% below baseline, and $559 million for King County Metro, which is at 36% below baseline. This is money that's going to incentivize business as usual. I don't think the infusion of federal cash into states' transportation systems and largely transit systems is going to make a significant difference in how they approach mobility in what is now a vastly changed landscape due to COVID. So I'm a little bit concerned about that and some of those, I think, perverse incentives in ongoing federal infusions of cash, especially when transit agencies continue to struggle substantially with ridership.
A proposal pitched as a way to lower state greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles would push cities and counties to pursue strategies for reducing vehicle miles traveled, basically discouraging vehicle use. Do you think that idea will be a big point of debate when lawmakers meet?
I most certainly hope it'll be a large point of debate. I think these policies really present a hardship for people who either depend on driving to get to work, who can't afford to live near large employment centers. I think these policies are fundamentally inequitable for people who really want to be competitive in the labor market, but are relegated to access to, a transit stop rather than a car or an ability to get to multiple job sites within a short period of time. Lawmakers really need to consider these trade-offs. If they care about people who are poor or who are immigrants, who are new in Washington State and who are really focused on upward mobility, they need to support modes that get people to the greatest number of jobs in the shortest amount of time. And right now, data shows that that is by automobile.
Given that the gasoline tax is really a primary funding source for roads and bridges in Washington State, and there are all these maintenance needs that we talked about, a lot of the money that is collected from gas tax is already committed based on bonds issued for previous projects. So how can lawmakers address these funding needs, and which direction would you recommend that they go in the interest of doing that?
Well, I think before lawmakers consider imposing tax increases or new tax systems on the public, they really need to do their due diligence in reducing costs. So those would be things like prevailing wage, environmental permitting, construction costs. I think there's also an opportunity and probably a need to look at what are programs that are currently funded out of transportation that are maybe more social programs that could be funded in the operating budget or the capital budget. If lawmakers are going to continue to support policies that chip away at our ability to drive, then they cannot complain when they receive less revenue from driving. This is a major policy conflict that has to be resolved in this transportation funding discussion.
What are the most pressing transportation issues right now? If you could give some examples of things that you think need attention sooner than other things.
Sure. So I think people are probably still concerned and possibly surprised that traffic congestion is pretty close to where it was before the pandemic. So I think fixing choke points needs to continue to be a priority, particularly through Pierce and King County and Snohomish County. I think that we need to prioritize congestion relief in places like Bellevue and the East Side. And by the way, this is a city where local officials are actually looking to eliminate congestion relief as a policy goal for the city, which is completely the opposite direction that we should be going in. Bellevue has to be a priority because it is such an important employment center in our state. West Seattle Bridge continues to be a sore point as well, though I know there's some debate around how those improvements would be funded. But again, I go back to congestion relief and maintenance and preservation, and some of the challenges that I think we will have in addressing those issues stem from the governor's COVID vaccine mandate, which has made solving those problems substantially more complicated and difficult.
Well, we're out of time, but thank you very much for your perspective. Again, Mariya Frost, Director of the Cole Center for Transportation at the Washington Policy Center. We appreciate your perspective.
Thank you.
There's a lot more where this came from. Check out tvw.org and download our app to watch more of the impact and find out what your state leaders are working on. You can also find out what's coming up and let us know what you think on Facebook and Twitter at the Impact TVW. That's all the time for this week's show. We hope to see you back here next week for more in-depth interviews you won't find anywhere else. I'm Mike McClanahan. Thanks for joining us.